Hey Miloš, welcome to the podcast. We are in Helsinki in your office in Aalto University, and the weather's been nice, but
So far.
so far, but we're preparing for some dark winters ahead. So Miloš, it's been good knowing you for I think it's past 4 or 5 years, and you've always been on the forefront of science and technology. I'd say the philosophy around science and technology in the area of mobility. So I was wondering, because you're such an outspoken critic of the way transport planning is done, and the past and future of automated vehicles and such topics, I was wondering what led you to this rather philosophical side of your research. Why the critiques?
Yeah. Well, what do they say? Everyone can be a philosopher if they just think long enough about the topic. So I guess time matters in a way. Over time, you start to learn some things, but I guess it's also, in a sense, maybe initial positive expectations I had about technology, which in some ways it's reasonable to have. Maybe when I started my studies, I thought that was a rather interesting thing to begin with. I was very curious about all these different kinds of what we used to call them intelligent transport systems.
Yeah.
Nowadays, smart mobility. But sort of through that process of kind of learning more and more about all that hardware and software, and trying to work with some of that technology myself, like really hands-on stuff, what usually happens is technology fails. Yeah, it just stops working the way it's initially intended. And again, this is not something that I have really kind of invented, but usually in those moments, sort of technology reveals itself when it stops working. Yeah, it comes into presence, usually in some kind of a background. You don't really kind of think about it, so much. So those were initial times when I started to think about, like, so why do we have these devices in the first place? Yeah, so kind of like a traffic signal controller. Like, why does it exist as a device? Yeah. And then you start digging, and then you realize that, well, it's path dependence, basically. It's like, why we have this? Well, because we had it for the trains and so on. So that's pretty much where then I started discovering that, of course, there is sort of people who have thought about technology
So
in various ways.
When I visited you in Delft, I remember the building you were working from. You mentioned the traffic lights. It's actually they had a few traffic lights just scattered around the corridors, and I thought that was interesting. It was like the engineers were working for, they're like demigods, as they were positioned in the hallways of the university of that department.
Yeah.
So how was that time at Delft in a rather more of an engineering culture there compared to Aalto?
Well, I guess in a sense it says it's in the name. It's University of Technology. So, but I mean, the same thing that I did in the US, I did it in Delft as well. I did not spend that much time inside of the department. I spent a lot more time in the library.
Yeah.
Because I mean, for me, that's the place where you go in and then you find any topic. That's what I really liked also about library in Delft, was that you could just go there, and in the whole shelf you would find all the 10 books on one topic, and then you can really dive into all that stuff. So but yeah, I very much agree with this kind of idolizing, especially if you think about, like, I mean, with all honesty, transport engineers, I think, have always had this identity crisis of like, we have to be engineers. Yeah. So like since the beginning, there is this obsession of like proving yourself worthy to be an engineer. Although I don't think it's spoken like out loud. It's this sort of subconscious stream that is just luring around. I mean, it goes back to kind of why if you think about all these like historical things, like how all these measurements of traffic were invented and like the graphs, like it was really like trying to look like, let's make graphs so we look like engineers and so on. That sort of mindset, identity that comes into that. And then of course these devices, because technically speaking, transport engineers don't make a traffic light, yeah? Like it's electrical engineers that make, or mechanical engineers, like those are the like, proper engineers.
Oh,
yeah?
that's interesting.
That make stuff of ITS or smart mobility. Like a transport engineer doesn't make that stuff. It's supposed to be the one who should of course be at the table thinking about these devices and how should they be used or not used, which is one of these fundamental questions that many engineers, we never ask like, should we even have this device at all? It's more like, where should we have it and that kind of stuff, in a sense. So, yeah, so I think there has always been that kind of undercurrent of kind of identity questions for engineers. And if you think about it also from a different perspective, all the transport technologies, the urban technologies, have been invented before the discipline of transport engineering. Yeah. So first we had bicycles and trains and cars, and then we were like, oh, we have a transport problem, so let's have a transport department or whatever. And of course, that many places came out of civil engineering. So it also is sort of, you're kind of, maybe the field is a little bit like, sort of like this unwanted child, yeah, kind of a thing as well. So but that's what I'm saying. Like there are some kind of like deeper undercurrents that we rarely study or talk about and so on, because like we are projecting this image of like, you know, technology, progress, solutions, functionality, all this sort of engineering kind of language and identity, when pretty much it's like, it should be basically, it shouldn't be even a field in engineering in a traditional sense, yeah? The reason why I think this is, of course, connected to engineering, or the way I think about engineering, it's not about quantitative anything or mathematics. It's actually about taking action. That's what engineering for me is like. Not just thinking about the problem, but like taking action on the problem. That's what, for me, engineering drills down to, yeah, bottom line. It's not about any of the other layers of identity that we create to glorify engineers in some societies.
So perhaps it's similar. My background is in economics, so perhaps similar in the case of economists, right? It's a branch. Economics as a science didn't exist. It used to be political science, philosophy, and the general, the social studies, I would say. So back in the Adam Smith's day, 1776, and then it progressed to more specialization. So philosophy remained philosophy, and then political science branched off, and economics branched off. But the economists wanted to be the most scientific of the bunch. I kind of see this in traffic engineering too, right? Economists claim to have more scientific methods. It's an economic science. They bought themselves a Nobel Prize from the Swedish bank. Yeah. So it's been interesting to see the progression of disciplines, and it's also interesting to think about how these disciplines weren't always there, but there is a need for each new discipline to establish their legitimacy before they can really progress as a separate body of knowledge. And I think traffic engineering is one of those disciplines that's not too, ancient. It's relatively young.
Yeah.
And have you read Peter Norton's book?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So that the 1920s were like a key milestone for the development of the traffic engineering profession, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So that's a very good example of. I of course learn or still learn a lot of economics of not the neoclassical kind, let's say. So yeah, I mean, in my mind, we of course have to think about these fields also emerging in a particular set of underlying values that are still mostly like certain restricted set of what we would call, of course, Western values. Yeah, it's not even the whole set of Western values. It's a specific set of those values at a specific point in time. And in some ways, I guess we have moved quite a lot from kind of the beginning, but in many ways we haven't. And especially this kind of assumptions about that somehow quantitative method is something that makes you a scientist, and then that there is this thing called science as a sort of a separate idea in itself, and then all this other stuff about kind of how important the field is. Yeah, so economists, you're dealing with money, you must be important, like this. Yeah, so isn't it?
So we have our gods, we have money, and we have traffic lights.
Yeah. So we are very good in kind of, but deep down, I mean, we're still the same primates from like 200,000 years ago. So we're like super good at this kind of like, oh, let's tribalize, let's like gather in a group and form, find an idol and then like trash the other idol, like, oh, you like money, or you like traffic lights, haha, at each other. Yeah. So I don't know. It's quite strange in so many ways. People think that somehow, I guess maybe people think that somehow kind of researchers or science are these sort of enlightened people of some kind of semi-aliens or whatever of a sort. But at the end of the day, we're still human, and we do all these like basic human mistakes. And sometimes even worse mistakes, given the amount of knowledge available there. But the other thing that you mentioned was the kind of, I was thinking, the reason why I'm in this field is because I think we discussed this also in other occasions, is basically because it gives me an opportunity to learn about anything. Yeah, because if you don't think about it anymore as traffic engineering, that is just looking at traffic as this physical phenomenon on the streets and so on, but you think about it as like mobility systems, the way I think about it, pretty much it's about everything. Yeah. So yesterday in the lecture we were talking about when did humans started to walk. So kind of like, yeah. So it goes back all the way there, and then of course it goes back to kind of what is justice, what is politics, and all that stuff. And so there's a lot of social sciences, a lot of philosophy is in a sense needed there. And then of course understanding these devices and their affordances and their constraints, and what is it that actually technology can do, and what is it that it fundamentally cannot do, because of course it's this iteration of technology that we have around us. So if we would just stay in the domain of the social sciences, I'm afraid that we will just end up in this kind of, again, the opposite, in a sense, mistake. If engineers are to blame for something, it's for like not thinking enough and kind of rushing to tinker with things, and then the social scientists are the much more like thinking too much, never doing anything. Yeah, kind of never doing any tinkering. So kind of that's the kind of, we have this discrepancy of speed of tinkering with technology. Like this is like super slow, and this one is too fast, and then kind of they're not really at an optimal position.
And you're really working to have a foot on both sides, right?
Yeah.
To move things forward, but also to think critically, which got me thinking. You mentioned this idea of progress earlier, and I read this book like 10 years ago. I think it was Burry is the author. The title is The Idea of Progress, and the book is about how progress as an idea didn't always exist, that it only became valued and the default way of thinking, after the Industrial Revolution, after our economies were really expected to grow year after year. Because if it doesn't grow nowadays, it's a big disaster, right? We can't accept stagnation, and that's how deeply ingrained this idea of progress has become now. And the economists took that to by putting that idea into numbers, right? GDP and economic growth and such. So I was wondering if there is this equivalent in the transport field or the mobility field where speed would be kind of this measurement of progress in a way, but also it's odd because we kind of peaked at the Concorde, right? Which you also talked about in your presentation. And then after the Concorde, we now, I think, especially in air travel, people have figured out that speed isn't necessarily the best thing, right? That we can make up for speed with other attributes such as comfort, etc. And also in train travel, we can see high-speed rail is still being built, but I've noticed that overnight sleeper trains are coming back, right? That especially the Austrian railway, they're forming and expanding their network of overnight rail, which is deliberately slow travel.
Yeah.
Right? They deliberately slow down the trains so other activities can take place. So what are your thoughts on the idea of speed and progress, and which way do you think we're going on that front?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question overall. So I think it kind of goes back to what I briefly touched upon, this kind of what kind of values that we bring into the discipline to begin with, and why are they still there? So certainly this kind of progress as a kind of a larger concept, it has sub-concepts, of course, but it also has its own roots. And I think it has a lot to do with, of course, also kind of times of colonial expansion that were happening at the same time as kind of modern science has been developed. So, I mean, evolution is progress, yeah, like of some kind. It's a process that takes its time, but it usually produces it results in a change, and oftentimes that change is different, substantially different than it was in the past, and of course it's about adapting to the environment. Yeah. I feel like we started with these ideas from a wrong end, kind of misunderstanding, because whatever you think about progress being change, you always have to think about change over what amount of time. I'm being like proper engineer,
The
so
triangle.
there has to be
Yeah.
an x-axis
The
with
delta.
time, and so on. So why do we need some things in 20 years as opposed to 200 years? Like the same question with this kind of imaginary self-driving vehicles that we are kind of chasing around to accomplish. Like, why do we need them now? Like, why is this a question of like, oh, we must have it now? Why don't we just have it in 2500? Like why is this a sort of a thing that we must like? So, kind of coming back to this sort of speed, and if you look at kind of how much damage we have done to ourselves, first of all, and then of course to the rest of the living beings on this planet in a rather short amount of time. So it's kind of like at which point, I mean, there were many points when we had very good well-being, yeah, 70s and 80s, especially 80s. We already kind of achieved a lot of well-being, especially in the Western, northern world. So, did we need all of that stuff from the 80s to now? Like, really need them for our survival, yeah? Like it was sort of must-have, yeah? So I'm not talking about the wants, that I want to have a smartphone, but like needing to have one to survive, yeah? Or to have like, not just survive, but like to have like a decent level of well-being on all of these indicators of well-being that we know. Psychological, mental, social, and so on. So that's kind of how I see it as well. You know, kind of so transport is just kind of reflecting back a lot of these underlying values, and these kinds of values are what kind of brought us to where we are right now. The fact that we have we're living on a planet that we're not really respecting the way it changes itself, because Earth is a process and it has its own sort of a dance, and we're kind of dancing out of sync. We're stepping on the toes of our dance partner, and it's not just that it hurts the dance partner, but we might also fall down together off the stage with the dance partner. So this progress, of course, is there so it goes back to this kind of notions of efficiency or accomplishment and all the other things over time. And I think we have successfully built those kinds of ideas into a lot of these kind of assumptions in classical transport engineering. Yeah. So the second part of my revelation about like kind of this field in which I was in, this was also in the US. So one was this technology failing to work, and then sort of like, like why? That's what brought it, in a sense, into being. And the other one was like realizing we're doing these calculations, and okay, now we're saving 7 seconds of time by recalculating green, red, yellow lights on an intersection. So we now are saving 7 seconds of time for a car. And I was like, I mean, yes, life is consisting of a lot of 7 seconds intervals, but like a human is still not a being of 7 seconds. I mean, a colibri might be one, or some kind of insect might have this notion of 7-second time of life is rather important, but for a human being, it's not 7 seconds. I mean, so why do we care about it, like in the first place? So there has, so that's that kind of moment started to be like, yeah, like what the hell are we doing? Even what does this matter?
The optimization problem, like forever solving smaller and smaller gains to the optimization problem. You mentioned you spent some time in the U.S. Could you refresh my memory on where that was and kind of what happened during that period of your life?
Yeah, well, I should probably start from the beginning. So I was educated. My bachelor comes from University of Belgrade. Yeah, we have this. There was this 5-story building built in the times of Socialist Federative Republic of Yugoslavia.
Back in the days.
Yeah. So it was built in a sense as a kind of a bigger hub to educate transport engineers for the new country in the 60s, in the last century. And the good thing about that place was that it was kind of created outside of civil engineering. Most likely due to kind of certain people recognizing that this needs to be more than civil engineering, kind of a way of thinking, but also it might have been like random circumstances, like just not having enough space in the civil engineering building and so on. So kind of civil engineering, the faculty is in a completely different part of Belgrade. You know, Belgrade has this kind of classical old campus where buildings are scattered around. And so this transport engineering building is a completely different part of town, and I think they brought basically all the disciplines they had at the university as a whole into this place, and said, in a sense, invent transport engineering. Yeah.
Amazing. Okay.
But of course, even there, given the starting point, so the original seed of an idea is a very different from, institutionally speaking, yeah?
Yeah.
Institution forms in a very different original idea as opposed to growing out of civil engineering or maybe in some places urban planning department, which is much rarer, but most of programs of transport emerge from civil engineering, yeah? Globally speaking, yeah. Even that place has, of course, over time been under so much pressure from the dominant transport engineering paradigm that comes mainly from the US, that you could see sort of these like conflicting, paradoxical thinking. Yeah, at the same time, you have people who have a lot more sort of social science and all the other stuff, understanding of the world, but at the same time, I mean, you have to fit into the main paradigm. Yeah, and who dictates the main paradigm is the US universities mostly. Yeah. Still, so you still have to kind of publish papers that they publish because they are sort of the US universities, because they are the ones establishing kind of the norm, yeah, and so on. So from that place, I ended up in the US. There's a funny story how I ended up there in the first place, but we can talk about it some other time maybe. But basically, in the US, I was in Virginia Tech, so it's also one of those hardcore civil engineering universities. So it's also University of Technology.
Yes.
As well. And they have a good transport. I mean, good. They have, according to the indicators, they have a good transport program. So of course, if you want to kind of learn the mainstream stuff, they were the place to go as well. So, but again, the beneficial thing with Virginia Tech was that so as opposed to the library in Belgrade, it was one floor or like half of one floor. Virginia had whatever 5 floors, big library. So. Sort of like Delft, quite big library, and then you could just go in and basically learn a lot just by yourself, yeah. Like and then of course, just because it was such a place that attracts people from all around the world, from all kinds of disciplines, I have learned a lot about various kinds of other stuff, just by having like friends and roommates and in whatever disciplines, yeah, like from kind of freeze and thaw cycle of blueberries to like, you know, cancer eating bacteria to whatever algae, and then like, you know, triple integral parallel programming people, like, you know, everything.
I was wondering that because of this time that you spent in the US, there's clearly the takeover of the automobile that has not happened to the same degree in Europe, right? So, and you talked about how the American ideology of transport planning has permeated around the world. In Sweden, in fact, we've had traffic engineers come over to Sweden and kind of present their American way of doing things to the traffic engineers there directly. So I'm wondering, in academia, do you see these ideas being also brought into Europe of traffic engineering, but somehow being prevented at the local level or prevented from being executed at the execution level? So by urban planners, by factors such as, you know, historical preservation or just not having the same amount of green space to develop, or do you think it's more of a more sensible approach to transport planning overall from the top down? Is there a difference in culture, do you think, between the American way and the European way? I'm generalizing, of course.
Yeah, to some extent, of course. I mean, to begin with, of course, the built environment was different to begin with. So there is only so much you can do with changes in the built environment, given its original or kind of previous versions. So that's one, but I don't think I would, of course, say we definitely need more studies of history on this kind of stuff. So I think the problem is still that it's very difficult to resist ideas. I mean, built environment is of course filled also with ideas as well, but ideas are even more powerful than the built environment, because eventually every structure degrades and falls apart after a certain amount of time, but sometimes ideas are almost impossible to get rid of in sort of over many centuries. Like this question of progress, for example, like we're still thinking about that, yeah, or growth and all these other kinds of things that are kind of keeping us on this very unsustainable path forward. So in my mind, I think there have been, of course, instances of individuals or smaller, or let's say institutions, trying to kind of not completely believe the mainstream narrative of transport engineering at the turn of the tide, so kind of the early 20th century, and then of course after the Second World War, the second wave. We have this example of city of Oulu in Finland, like super small place up north, yeah.
Winter cycling city.
Yeah. So kind of why? Because at some point there was some planner, Maori, who was kind of thinking about cycling and not necessarily fully believing that the car is the progress by itself. And I mean, he faced substantial opposition from every possible way, yeah. Sort of like, why are you doing this, yeah? Like, not just kind of from politicians, from colleagues, from residents, from everyone, yeah. So it was pure set of circumstances that eventually resulted in some of these changes in the built environment that were happening because of that, so that Oulu still has quite a lot of cycling. But of course, even that city has over time managed to spread and sprawl, and there is still a lot of, like, you know, car dependence overall, because the system of planning is still pro kinds of those kinds of results, yeah. So what I'm saying is basically we need to probably look more. We need more historical studies trying to find these kind of pockets of resistance, of kind of active resistance. Yeah, I think there has been, of course, just sheer a lack of resources, or kind of just not caring about whatever the kind of the mainstream paradigm is trying to teach, and then many places might have just not done much because they wouldn't have done much otherwise, yeah. I think we have to, of course, assume that kind of a category as well. But then, I mean, still largely, even in Europe, if you go outside of the city center, in every city, you'll find motorways, I mean, everywhere, yeah. And all kind of coming into the urban core and so on, so...
This reminds me, right? John Maynard Keynes, 1930s, he said, practical men who believe themselves quite exempt from any intellectual influences are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. And then in planning textbook, which I'm teaching the students right now, like Peter Hall echoed that and says, and so it goes for urban planners. And now I'm thinking, yeah. Traffic engineers are the defunct economists, right, of our mobility system.
Yeah.
And this what a fascinating story from the establishing traffic engineering in like an isolated bubble, right, where you grew up, and then going to the dominant culture, which is the U.S., and then coming to Europe to see, what I think a sense of the alternative of what resistance could look like, right, to the dominant narrative. So I was wondering briefly what you're working on these days. So you're quite active on the publishing, and I was thinking, like, you come up with many empirical papers, and once in a while you'll come up with an opinion piece, right, where you rant about like the paradigm, and then you go back and publish a few more empirical papers. So what are you working on right now on the empirical side?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I will probably not like to make it too much about myself.
General direction,
Yeah.
like you did.
Because I mean, I know that academics like to talk about themselves quite a lot. That's part of the problem, probably, as well, in this kind of sort of questions of progress and growth and all that stuff. So for me, the bigger question is now, so after I have kind of achieved this research excellence and have tenure, it's what can I do to kind of build more an institution? Or not myself build, but like that would be presumptuous of a single individual building anything. But sort of what can I enable so that we start to grow a different kind of institution? And at the same time, I also don't have a completely clear idea of what kind of future, like how should this field look like? Ideally, yeah. I know that there are certain ingredients, which is we need to, of course, have multiple ways of looking at the world, and we have to kind of have this sort of systems thinking approach and everything else around that. So that's kind of my bigger question behind. So all these other kind of researchers that we have in the group who are kind of studying different topics from human behavior to kind of governance processes, planning processes, various kinds of things around that. To me, the bigger question is like, what is kind of the common thread is we're all trying to be critical about existing ways of thinking in various subfields, of course, of all of this field at large. So yeah, that's kind of one bigger question, because at the end of the day, we need to find ways to build viable alternative ways of thinking and publishing and all that other stuff that comes from academia. But on the other side, the world is not university. Yeah? So what I am more concerned with nowadays is what can I do. We of course would, in traditional language, we would call it social impact. I need to impact society. But I'm thinking more about again, that kind of what are the sort of critical points of connecting people more and kind of growing the institution also in the wider sense of kind of new ways of planning and thinking about technology.
Changing
mobility.
trajectories, right? We're
Yeah.
going here, a small nudge.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's a big impact in the
Yeah.
future.
And the fundamental challenge for me is that, of course, I mean, you don't create an institution by just me doing stuff. I mean, that's not an institution. Institution is a set of rules and ideas, and that needs to be distributed. It needs to kind of grow as a network of different people and different ideas and different practices ways of doing and so on. So that's in a sense where I'm right now. Yeah. So kind of research in a sense is something that is just means to a larger end. It's not an end in itself. I mean, I don't think my purpose in life at this point onwards is publishing papers or having citations. I think I have done that. I have proved myself of a certain level. I have tenure, and I firmly believe that this world right now does not depend on one more paper or one more citation, but it needs more knowledge put into action.
And tenure is a protection to exercise intellectual freedom,
Yeah.
right? Which is the stage you're at now, and I think that's very wise.
Well, that's what the institution was
Yes.
invented. The institution of tenure was invented for. Yeah?
Mhm.
You prove yourself, sort of through kind of research excellence, to be at a certain level. What I'm afraid, I mean, I'm kind of now taking this year as a sort of a liminal phase of my life, transitioning between the past and the unknown future of my own career. It basically kind of goes back to the fundamental question of why. Yeah, I think I mentioned it too. Why do we need professors? Yeah. So what's the point of all of this that we're doing? So if we have that kind of freedom if it is really freedom to think and so on, that to me is something that has to be used very responsibly. And it's so easy to just fall back into the old habits. I mean, I know how to publish papers.
Yeah.
Like I can write 10 papers this year. I will write 12 papers next year, and so on. I will keep on increasing my productivity, growth. I will have more and more citations, and so
Exponentially,
on.
yeah.
And then, so what? So I will have like, is my tombstone going to have a Google Scholar citation? I would rather have it say something, you know, he tried to be a human.
And with that, it's time's up. You got a next meeting.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Miloš.
Yes, thank you as well.
And best of luck on changing the world.
Well, I think the world will need a lot of luck to change itself.
Excellent. Thank you again.
Yes, thank you.